The cliff did not fall the way Jake had planned. Instead of bringing down the whole mountain, his work had created a controlled collapse that sealed off part of the cave system. Tons of rock crashed down, but they fell in exactly the wrong place, blocking Jake's escape route instead of crushing the Shadow Maw. Jake found himself trapped in a small chamber with no way out, except the passage where the Shadow Maw was breaking through. He could hear the creature getting closer. The sound of claws on rock echoed through the cave, along with that terrible breathing that sounded like wind through a graveyard. Jake looked around his prison. The chamber was about the size of a large room, with rough walls and a ceiling just high enough for him to stand up straight. There were loose rocks scattered on the floor, and a few small openings that led to passages too narrow even for him to crawl through. This was not how he had wanted the fight to end, but Jake was not ready to give up. He still had weapons, and he still had his brain. Sometimes that was enough. Jake quickly gathered all the loose stones he could find and piled them near the entrance to the chamber. Then he took his position behind the largest boulder and waited with his sling ready. The Shadow Maw finally broke through. The creature had to squeeze to fit through the passage, which slowed it down and made it an easier target. Jake let fly with his sling, sending stone after stone at the monster's head and eyes. Most of his shots bounced off the thick armor plates, but a few found their mark. One stone struck the creature's wounded shoulder, making it roar with pain. Another hit it right in the eye, and the Shadow Maw shook its massive head like an angry dog. But the stones were not enough to stop it. The Shadow Maw pushed into the chamber and stood up to its full height, nearly touching the ceiling. In the small space, it looked even more terrifying than before. Jake had nowhere to run. The creature moved toward him slowly, confident now that it had its prey cornered. Its yellow eyes glowed in the dim light from the cave entrance. Saliva dripped from its teeth onto the stone floor. Jake backed against the far wall of the chamber, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might explode. He had one spear left, and a few more stones for his sling. Against a monster this size, in a space this small, those weapons seemed like toys. But as the Shadow Maw approached, Jake noticed something important. The creature was moving carefully, keeping its injured leg off the ground as much as possible. The spear wounds from his pit trap were worse than they had looked. Dark blood was still flowing from the holes in its leg and side. The Shadow Maw was hurt. Maybe hurt badly enough to make a difference. Jake waited until the creature was close enough to touch him. Then he dove to one side, rolling across the rocky floor and coming up behind the monster. The Shadow Maw spun around with incredible speed, but the movement put weight on its injured leg. The creature stumbled off balance for just a moment. That moment was all Jake needed. He drove his last spear deep into the wound on the Shadow Maw's leg, twisting it and pushing it in as far as it would go. The creature screamed and swung one
massive arm at Jake's head. Jake ducked, but not fast enough. The Shadow Maw's claws caught him across the back, tearing through his shirt and opening long cuts in his skin.
Jake rolled away, blood running down his back, and grabbed a handful of sharp stones from his pile. The Shadow Maw tried to pull the spear out of its leg, but the weapon had gone in at an angle and was stuck between bones. Every time the creature moved, the spear twisted and caused more damage. Jake threw his stones as hard as he could. Without his sling, they did not have much power, but in the small chamber he could not miss. The stones struck the Shadow Maw's face and chest, each one adding to its pain and anger. The creature gave up trying to remove the spear and came after Jake with murder in its yellow eyes. Jake ran in circles around the chamber, staying just out of reach of those terrible claws. The Shadow Maw chased him, but its injured leg made it clumsy. Every few steps the creature would stumble or have to stop and catch its balance. But Jake was getting tired too. The cuts on his back were bleeding badly, and he had been running and fighting for hours. He could not keep this up much longer. He needed to end the fight now while he still had the strength to move. Jake had one last idea. It was crazy and dangerous, but everything he had tried so far had been crazy and dangerous. That was what humans were good at, doing impossible things with simple tools. The next time the Shadow Maw charged at him, Jake did not run away. Instead, he ran straight at the monster. The creature was so surprised that it hesitated for just a second. Jake used that second to dive between the Shadow Maw's legs and roll to the other side of the chamber. But he was not trying to escape. He was trying to reach the pile of rocks he had stacked near the entrance. Jake grabbed the largest stone he could lift, a chunk of granite about the size of a bowling ball. The Shadow Maw turned to follow him, putting all its weight on the injured leg. Jake threw the heavy stone with everything he had left. The stone struck the spear that was stuck in the Shadow Maw's leg, driving it deeper and breaking it off inside the wound. The creature screamed and collapsed, its leg no longer able to support its weight. But the Shadow Maw was not dead. It pulled itself across the floor with its arms, still trying to reach Jake. Its claws left deep scratches in the stone as it dragged, its huge body forward. Jake looked around desperately for another weapon. There were still some small stones on the ground, but nothing big enough to finish off a monster this size. Then he saw something that made him smile. The collapse of the cliff had left a crack in the ceiling of the chamber. The crack was held up by one large stone that looked like it might fall at any moment. Jake grabbed his sling and his last throwing stone. He had one shot to bring down that loose rock and drop it on the Shadow Maw's head. The creature was almost close enough to grab him with its claws. Jake could smell its breath, hot and terrible, as it opened its mouth to bite him in half. Jake loaded his sling and took aim at the stone in the ceiling. The world seemed to slow down. Jake could see every detail of the rock he was aiming at. He could feel the weight of the stone in his sling. He could hear his own heartbeat and the Shadow Maw's breathing and the small sounds of pebbles falling from the damaged ceiling. Jake released the stone. It flew straight up and struck the loose rock in exactly the right spot. The ceiling stone fell like a meteor, striking the Shadow Maw directly on top of its massive skull. The sound was like a mountain breaking apart. The monster collapsed to the floor and did not move again. Jake sat down heavily on the rocky ground, breathing hard and trying to believe that he was still alive. His back hurt where the Shadow Maw's claws had cut him. His hands were bleeding from handling sharp rocks for 3 days. He was covered in dust and dirt and monster blood, but he was alive. And the Shadow Maw was dead. Jake had done something that only 5 or 6 beings in the entire galaxy had ever accomplished. He had killed a Shadow Maw with nothing but rocks and sticks and human cleverness. Now he just had to survive until the rescue ships arrived in a few hours. Jake crawled over to the cave entrance and looked out at Zerion 7. The twin suns were setting, again painting the canyon walls red and gold. Somewhere out there, other students were still trying to survive their own battles with fear and monsters. But Jake's battle was over. He had won. Jake sat in the cave entrance and watched the stars come out over Zerion 7. His whole body ached, and the cuts on his back had stopped bleeding but still hurt when he moved. The dead Shadow Maw lay behind him in the chamber, already starting to smell bad in the hot air, but Jake felt good, better than good. He felt like he could take on the whole galaxy. The rescue ships arrived just as the twin suns were rising on his 4th day. Jake heard the sound of engines echoing through the canyon and saw bright lights moving across the sky. Search teams were looking for survivors among the 43 students who had taken the final exam. Jake crawled out of the cave and waved his arms at the flying ships. One of them saw him and landed in a clear area near the canyon floor. The door opened and 3 figures in environmental suits stepped out. The first one was Professor Vex, his crystal body flashing rainbow colors in the morning light. Behind him came Dr. Rodriguez, a human woman who worked as a cultural advisor at the academy. The third person was someone Jake did not recognize, a tall alien with blue skin and too many eyes. "Human Jake," Professor Vex said as he approached the cave. His voice sounded different than usual, less sure of himself. "You appear to have survived the examination." "Yes, sir," Jake said. He was so tired that standing up straight was hard work. "Where did you shelter during the trial?" "We detected seismic activity in this area, several cliff collapses and rock slides." Jake pointed back toward the cave. "In there, mostly. I had some trouble with the local wildlife." Dr. Rodriguez stepped Farfpur. She was a small woman with gray hair and kind eyes. "Jake, are you injured? You have blood on your clothes." "Just some scratches. Nothing serious." The blue-skinned alien was scanning the area with some kind of device. It made beeping sounds as he pointed it at different rocks and cave openings. Suddenly, the beeping got very fast and very loud. "Professor," the alien said in a voice like grinding metal, "I am reading massive biosignatures from inside this cave. Something very large died in there recently." Professor Vex's crystal body went completely clear, which Jake had learned meant surprise or shock. Large? How large? 12 feet tall, approximately. Very heavy bone structure. The scent signature matches. The alien checked his device again. "This is impossible. It matches Shadow Maw remains." Professor Vex and Dr. Rodriguez looked at each other, then at Jake, then at the cave entrance. "Human Jake," Professor Vex said slowly. "Please tell us exactly what happened during your examination," Jake told them. He explained about studying the canyon and making tools and setting traps. He described the battle with the Shadow Maw and how he had finally killed it by dropping a rock on its head. When he finished talking, nobody said anything for a long time. Finally, Dr. Rodriguez spoke. "Jake, do you understand what you have accomplished? In 300 years of testing, only 6 students have ever killed a Shadow Maw. Most barely managed to survive by hiding or running away. And those 6 were all from warrior species," Professor Vex added. His voice was very quiet. "Beings with natural weapons and armor. Not..." He paused. "Not primitive humans with rocks and sticks?" Jake suggested. Professor Vex's crystal face somehow managed to look embarrassed. "I may have underestimated your species, human Jake." The blue-skinned alien had been scanning inside the cave with his device. Now he came back outside, all of his eyes wide with amazement. "The Shadow Maw is definitely dead," he announced. "But the way it died, there are tool marks on the rocks, primitive construction, evidence of systematic trap-making and battlefield preparation. This was not a lucky accident, this was planned warfare." Dr. Rodriguez smiled. "Professor Vex, I think you are about to learn something very important about human beings. We are not the strongest species in the galaxy. We are not the fastest or the smartest or the most naturally gifted, but we are very, very good at solving problems." They spent the next hour examining Jake's canyon battlefield. Professor Vex and the other alien looked at every trap Jake had built, every tool he had made, every tactical decision he had used to turn the terrain into a weapon. "Remarkable," Professor Vex kept saying. "Absolutely remarkable." Other rescue ships were finding the remaining students. Of the 43 who had started the examination, 31 had survived by hiding or running from their Shadow Maws. Narration had been killed. 3 had been so badly injured that they needed immediate medical treatment, and 1 had killed the most dangerous predator in the known galaxy, using nothing but rocks and rope and 3,000 years of human stubbornness. When they returned to the academy, word of Jake's accomplishment spread quickly. Students who had laughed at the primitive human now followed him through the hallways, asking questions about his hunting techniques and trap-making skills. Crix, Jake's roommate, was one of the survivors. His bioelectric powers had kept his Shadow Maw at a distance long enough for the rescue ships to arrive. "Human Jake," Crix said as they sat in their room that evening. "I owe you an apology. I said you had no natural weapons. I was wrong. I don't have claws or electric discharge or sonic blasts," Jake said. "Those things would have been nice to have." "No," Crix replied, his tentacles moving in what Jake had learned was the Aquarian gesture for deep respect. "You have something better. You have the ability to make weapons out of anything, to turn the whole world into your tool." Jake smiled. "My species learned a long time ago that when you can't fight harder, you have to fight smarter." The graduation ceremony was held. A week later, Jake stood with the other passing students in the Great Hall, while Professor Vex announced their scores and accomplishments. When Jake's name was called, the professor said something that had never been said before in the 300-year history of the Academy. "Human Jake Morrison," Professor Vex announced to the assembled crowd. "Perfect score. First successful Shadow Maw kill by a student from a non-warrior species. Recommended for immediate advanced placement in the Galactic Federation. Strategic Command." The applause went on for 5 minutes. Students from dozens of different worlds, beings who had thought humans were weak and primitive, stood and cheered for the small primate who had taught them what real strength looked like. But the best part came later, in a private meeting with the Academy's board of directors. "Human Jake," said Director Wextall, the most senior Zephyrian at the Academy. "Your achievement has caused us to reconsider our policies. We have always limited the number of human students based on our belief that your species lacked natural combat abilities." Jake waited to hear what was coming next. "We were wrong. Starting next year, we will accept human applicants based on their academic qualifications alone. No species quotas, no assumptions about natural abilities." Jake grinned. "I think you will be surprised by what my people can do, Director." "I think we already have been," Director Wextall replied. When Jake returned to Earth, he was welcomed as a hero. His success had opened the door for full human membership in the Galactic Federation. Trade agreements were signed. Technology was shared. Earth's children would grow up as citizens of the galaxy, not as primitive beings begging for acceptance. But Jake's real achievement was not political or economic. It was philosophical. For the first time in galactic history, the advanced alien species understood that evolution was not just about growing bigger claws or stronger armor or more powerful energy blasts. Sometimes evolution was about learning to pick up a rock, and when you knew how to use rocks properly, you could move mountains. Jake Morrison had proven that humans belonged in the galaxy not because they were the strongest or the fastest, but because they were the species that could turn anything into a tool and any problem into a puzzle to be solved. The galaxy would never underestimate humans again. And back on Zerion 7, in a canyon that now bore Jake's name, young shadow moths learned to be afraid of the scent of beings who walked on two legs and had no claws. Because those beings were the most dangerous hunters in the galaxy. They just used different weapons than everyone else. Jake Miller stood at the large window of the Galactic Science Academy and looked out at the strange purple sky of Proxima Station. 3 months had passed since he left Earth to study here. The academy was huge, bigger than any building he had ever seen back home. It floated in space like a small city, with metal walls that curved up and down in ways that hurt his brain when he tried to understand them. Students from dozens of different planets walked through the halls every day. Some had 4 arms, others had no arms at all. Some breathed air like Jake did, while others carried small machines that made the right kind of gas for their lungs. Jake had stopped staring at them after the first week. Now they just seemed normal. Jake came here to study old things, dead things, things that lived millions of years ago on planets far from Earth. The Academy called it xenoarchaeology, which was just a fancy word for digging up alien bones and trying to figure out how they lived. Jake loved this work more than anything else in the world. But the Academy had rules, lots of rules. Too many rules, Jake thought. The biggest rule was the cave rule. No students could go into caves. Not any caves, anywhere. The rule had been made just 2 months before Jake arrived. Before that, students could explore caves if they had permission and the right safety gear. Now caves were totally forbidden. Director Velthar 9 had announced the rule during a big meeting in the main hall. Velthar 9 was a Zephyrian, which meant it looked like a tall blue tree with eyes. It spoke in a voice that sounded like wind blowing through leaves. "Cave exploration has become too dangerous," Velthar 9 had said. "In the past year, we have had 17 incidents involving unstable rock formations. 3 students were injured. Equipment worth millions of credits was lost. From this day forward, all cave systems on all Academy research planets are forbidden to students." The other students had nodded and accepted this news without question. That was the alien way, Jake had learned. When authority figures made rules, aliens followed them. They did not argue or complain, they just did what they were told. Jake was different. He was human, and humans asked questions. After the meeting, Jake had gone to Professor Keth Nor to learn more about the cave ban. Professor Keth Nor was Jake's favorite teacher. It belonged to a species called the tentacled ones, which meant it had 12 long arms and a brain the size of a watermelon. Professor Keith Nor knew more about ancient life forms than anyone else at the Academy. "Why are caves so dangerous?" Jake had asked. Humans have been exploring caves for thousands of years. We have good safety equipment now. We know how to do it right. Professor Kethnor had looked at Jake with all 6 of its eyes. When it spoke, its voice made a sound like water running over rocks. That is exactly the problem, Jake Miller, the professor had said. Humans think they know how to do dangerous things safely. Other species know that some risks are not worth taking. We have evolved to avoid unnecessary danger. Humans have evolved to run toward it. Jake had not liked this answer. He thought it was wrong. Caves were not just dangerous holes in the ground, they were libraries. They held the history of planets written in stone and bone. The most important discoveries always came from the places that were hardest to reach. But Professor, Jake had said, the best fossils are always found in caves. That is where animals go to die when they are sick or old. That is where their bones get protected from wind and rain. If we cannot explore caves, we will miss the most important discoveries. Professor Kethnor had made a sound that Jake learned meant disagreement. All 12 of its arms had waved in the air like angry snakes. This is human thinking, the professor had said. You believe that the biggest discoveries require the biggest risks. Other species believe that staying alive is more important than finding old bones. We prefer to make small, safe discoveries rather than risk death for big ones. Jake had left that conversation feeling frustrated. He understood that the academy wanted to keep students safe. That was good. But he also knew that some of the most important scientific discoveries in human history had been made by people who took risks that others thought were stupid. Cave exploration was not stupid if you did it right. Jake had been exploring caves since he was 12 years old. His father had taught him how to read rock formations, how to test air quality, how to move safely through tight spaces. Jake knew more about cave safety than most of the alien professors at the academy. But knowing this did not change the rules. And the rules were very clear. No caves, no exceptions. Any student caught violating the cave exploration ban would be expelled immediately and sent back to their home planet. Jake spent the next few weeks trying to focus on his regular studies. He attended lectures about fossil classification. He practiced using dating equipment on rock samples. He wrote reports about extinct alien life forms. But his mind kept wandering to the caves of Kepler 442c, the planet that served as the Academy's main research site. Kepler 442c was only a short shuttle ride from Proxima Station. The planet had the right atmosphere for most species, including humans. More importantly, it had limestone. Lots of limestone. And limestone meant caves, big caves, old caves, caves that had been protecting fossils for millions of years. The Academy's geological surveys showed that Kepler 442c had cave systems that stretched for hundreds of kilometers underground. Some of the caves were so deep that the Academy's scanning equipment could not map their full extent. The mineral composition of the rock interfered with the sensors, creating blank spots on the maps where anything could be hiding. Jake stared at those blank spots on the geological charts every night before bed. He imagined what secrets they might hold. What ancient life forms might be sleeping in those dark places, waiting for someone brave enough to find them. But Jake was just one student at a huge academy full of rules. And the cave rule was the biggest rule of all. Jake could not stop thinking about the caves. Every night he pulled up the geological maps of Kepler 442c on his personal computer. The limestone formations were perfect for fossil preservation. The blank spots on the scanner maps made his hands shake with excitement. Somewhere down there in the dark, millions of years of planetary history waited for someone to discover it. The Academy had strict rules about research equipment. Students could request basic tools for approved projects, but everything had to be logged and tracked. Jake needed cave exploration gear, but asking for it would raise questions he could not answer, so Jake got creative. He went to the supply depot on level 12 of the Academy. The supply coordinator was a hive mind collective that looked like a walking pile of metal cubes. Each cube had a different personality, but they all shared the same brain. Jake had learned that the hive minds were very good at following procedures, but not very good at seeing the big picture. I need geological sampling equipment, Jake told the supply coordinator, for surface rock analysis on Kepler 442c. The blue cube on top of the pile blinked twice. Please specify required equipment. Jake had prepared for this question. He had spent hours researching what tools were used for surface geology work. Most of the equipment was the same as cave exploration gear. I need a portable scanner, sample collection bags, a hammer and chisel set, safety helmet with light, emergency oxygen supply, rope and climbing harness, and a backup communication device, Jake said. The red cube near the bottom made a clicking sound. Purpose of rope and harness for surface work? Jake's heart beat faster, but he kept his voice calm. Some of the best surface formations are on cliff faces. I need to rappel down to reach them safely. This was not completely a lie. Some surface geology work did require rope access. Jake was just not planning to use the equipment on surface rocks. The green cube on the left side hummed for a moment. Request approved. Equipment available for pickup tomorrow at 0800 hours. Duration of requisition? 1 week, Jake said. Acknowledged. Student Jake Miller logged for equipment requisition 7731B. Next. Jake walked away from the supply depot, trying not to smile too much. The hive minds were efficient, but they did not ask questions that were not in their programming. They had approved his equipment request without wondering why a xenoarchaeology student needed climbing gear. The next day, Jake picked up his equipment and loaded it into a small transport bag. The gear was lighter than the stuff he had used in caves back on Earth, but it looked like it would do the job. The portable scanner was especially nice. It could create three-dimensional maps of underground spaces in real time. Jake waited for the weekend. Most students spent weekends attending cultural exchange programs or social events in the academy's recreation areas. Jake usually joined them, but this weekend he told his classmates he was feeling sick and needed to rest. On Saturday morning, Jake took a shuttle to Kepler 442c. The shuttle pilot was a crystalline named Zexcor who made this trip 6 times a day. Jake had ridden with Zexcor before for regular class field trips. The pilot barely noticed him. Surface research again? Zexcor asked as the shuttle approached the planet's atmosphere. Yes, Jake said. Looking for some specific mineral formations the professor mentioned. Acknowledged. Return pickup at 1800 hours as scheduled? That should be fine, Jake said. The shuttle landed at Research Station Alpha, the Academy's main base on Kepler 442c. The station was mostly empty on weekends. A few automated systems ran maintenance checks, but no other students or faculty were around. Jake walked away from the station toward the hills where the geological maps showed the entrance to the Meridian cave system. The entrance was about 2 kilometers from the research station, hidden behind a cluster of red rock formations. Jake had studied satellite images of this area for weeks. The cave entrance was just a crack in the rock face, maybe 3 meters wide and 2 meters tall. Scanner data showed that the crack opened into a much larger chamber about 50 meters inside the hill. When Jake reached the cave entrance, he stopped and checked his equipment one more time. Helmet and light working properly. Scanner fully charged, emergency oxygen full tank. Communication device connected to Academy emergency frequencies. Rope and climbing harness properly secured. Jake had been exploring caves for 8 years. He knew that preparation was everything. Humans might be willing to take risks that other species avoided, but that did not mean they had to be stupid about it. The crack in the rock face was narrower than it looked in the satellite images. Jake had to turn sideways and suck in his stomach to squeeze through the entrance. His equipment bag scraped against the rock walls as he pushed deeper into the darkness. After 20 meters of tight crawling, the passage opened up into a large chamber. Jake stood up and turned on his helmet light. The beam cut through the darkness and showed him something that made his heart stop. The chamber was enormous. His light could not reach the far walls or the ceiling. Stalactites hung down like giant teeth, and the floor was covered with smooth rock formations that looked like frozen waterfalls. This was exactly the kind of environment where fossils were, preserved perfectly. Jake pulled out his scanner and began mapping the chamber. The device sent out sound waves that bounced off the walls and created a 3-dimensional picture of the space. According to the scanner, the chamber was over 100 meters wide and 30 meters tall. Multiple passages led deeper into the hill. Jake walked carefully across the chamber floor, sweeping his light back and forth. Almost immediately, He saw what he was looking for. There, embedded in a limestone wall, was the outline of something that had been alive millions of years ago. It was a fossil unlike anything Jake had ever seen. The creature appeared to have been about 2 meters long with a segmented body and multiple limbs. But the limbs were not like anything in the Academy's databases. They were too complex, too purposeful. They looked almost like tools. Jake took detailed photographs of the fossil and collected small rock samples from around it. The scanner data showed that this fossil was part of a much larger deposit. The walls of this chamber contained dozens, maybe hundreds of similar remains. But this was just the beginning. The scanner showed that the cave system extended much deeper into the planet. Multiple levels, connected by natural passages and what looked like artificial modifications. Artificial modifications meant only one thing: some intelligent species had been here before, long before the current galactic civilizations had even evolved. They had widened passages, carved stairs, and created chambers for purposes that Jake could only guess at. Jake looked at his watch. He had been in the cave for 3 hours. He had planned to spend only a few hours exploring, just enough to confirm that the caves were worth the risk. But what he had found was so much more important than he had expected. Jake made a decision that would change everything. Instead of returning to the surface, he activated his emergency beacon to extend his pickup time and went deeper into the cave system. The Academy's rules said caves were forbidden, but the Academy's rules had never encountered a human who had found evidence of an ancient unknown civilization. Jake spent the next 2 days living in the caves. He had packed enough food and water for a day trip, but he stretched his supplies by eating small portions and drinking only when necessary. Human endurance training from his childhood helped him push through hunger and fatigue. The cave system was much more complex than the Academy's surface scans had shown. Jake mapped 17 different chambers connected by natural passages and artificial tunnels. The artificial sections were the most interesting. Someone had carved steps into steep rock faces. Someone had widened narrow cracks to make them passable. Someone had built drainage systems to keep water from flooding the lower levels. The work was old, very old. Jake's scanner estimated that some of the artificial modifications were over 5 million years old. That was impossible according to current galactic history. The oldest known civilization was only 2 million years old. But the evidence was right there in the rock. Jake's human body let him explore passages that would have been impossible for most alien species. His compact frame squeezed through openings that would have trapped the larger Zephyrians. His flexible joints bent in ways that the rigid crystalline species could never match. His binocular vision helped him judge distances and spot handholds in the darkness. Most importantly, his human brain was good at seeing patterns. Aliens were smart, but they thought in very logical ways. Human brains were messier. They made connections that did not always make perfect sense, but sometimes those crazy connections led to big discoveries. On his second day in the caves, Jake found the tablets. He was exploring the deepest chamber he had reached so far, about 300 meters below the surface. His scanner showed that this chamber was completely artificial. The walls were too smooth, the angles too perfect. This room had been carved by intelligent hands. The chamber contained 12 stone tablets arranged in a circle around a raised platform. Each tablet was covered with symbols that looked like a combination of mathematics and star charts. Jake had never seen anything like them in any of the Academy's databases. Jake photographed every symbol on every tablet. He took measurements of the chamber dimensions. He collected tiny samples of the stone material for later analysis. But even without detailed study, he could tell that these tablets contained important information. The mathematical symbols were similar to the systems used by current galactic civilizations, but more advanced. The star charts showed stellar positions that Jake recognized, but they were drawn from a perspective that would only be accurate if viewed from this exact planet millions of years ago. Whoever had made these tablets had been here when Kepler 442c was in a different position in its orbit around the local star. They had watched the sky and recorded the movement of other stars with incredible precision. They had developed mathematics that current species were only beginning to understand. But the biggest discovery was still waiting for Jake in the chamber beyond the tablets. A narrow passage led from the tablet chamber to one final room. Jake had to crawl on his belly for 20 meters to reach it, but when he emerged into the space beyond, he forgot about his scraped knees and sore back. The final chamber contained fossilized remains of the species that had built everything else. There were 12 skeletons arranged around the walls of the chamber. Each skeleton was about 3 meters tall and had 6 limbs. 4 of the limbs were clearly for walking and running. The other 2 were arms, but not like human arms. These arms had multiple joints and ended in hands with 8 fingers each. The hands looked like they could manipulate very small objects with incredible precision. The skulls were the most interesting part. They were large, much larger than human skulls, but the bone structure suggested intelligence. Eye sockets, brain case, jaw formation, everything indicated a species that had been at least as smart as current galactic civilizations, possibly smarter. Jake spent hours documenting the skeletons. He took photographs from every angle. He measured bone lengths and joint angles. He collected tiny samples for age dating. The work was slow and careful, the kind of detailed documentation that would satisfy even the pickiest professors back at the academy. But while Jake worked, his mind raced, with questions. Who were these beings? Where had they come from? Where had they gone? Why had they built this complex cave system? What had happened to them? Some of the answers were written on the walls. The final chamber was covered with carvings that told a story. Jake's scanner created detailed maps of every carving, but even without translation software, he could understand the basic narrative. The carvings showed the ancient species arriving on Kepler 442c from somewhere else. They showed cities being built on the surface. They showed exploration of space, contact with other worlds, development of advanced technology. The early carvings were full of hope and progress. The later carvings told a different story. Something had gone wrong. The surface cities were abandoned. The species retreated underground. The final carvings showed the last survivors gathering in this chamber to record their history before they died. Jake found one carving that made his blood run cold. It showed the night sky as it would have appeared millions of years ago, with one addition that should not have been there, a star that burned brighter than all the others. A star that was moving. Jake knew enough astronomy to understand what that meant. The bright moving star was not a star at all. It was a supernova. A massive stellar explosion that would have sent deadly radiation across multiple star systems. The ancient species had not died from war or disease. They had been killed by cosmic radiation from an exploding star. They had retreated to the caves to escape the radiation, but it had not been enough. In the end, they had died here in the dark, leaving only their bones and their story carved in stone. But they had left one more thing. Something that would change everything for the current galactic civilizations. On the wall behind the largest skeleton, Jake found a carving that showed a map of the galaxy. Not just the local region that current species had explored, but the entire galaxy. Hundreds of star systems, thousands of planets, trade routes between civilizations that no longer existed. The map showed habitable worlds that current galactic explorers had never found. It showed the locations of resources that could solve energy shortages and material scarcity problems. It showed safe passage routes through dangerous regions of space that current ships avoided. Most importantly, it showed that the galaxy had once been full of intelligent life. Dozens of species, hundreds of civilizations, a vast network of cooperation, and trade that had existed for millions of years before the supernova destroyed it all. Jake stared at the galactic map until his helmet light began to dim. His equipment batteries were running low. His food was gone. His water was almost finished. It was time to return to the surface. But as Jake prepared to leave the chamber, he realized that his discovery would change everything, not just for him, but for every species in the current galaxy. The ancient civilization had left behind the greatest treasure in galactic history, a complete map of inhabitable worlds and the knowledge of how to reach them safely. Jake gathered his equipment and began the long climb back to the surface. He had violated the Academy's most important rule, but he was returning with the most important discovery in galactic history. Now he just had to figure out how to explain that to director Felthar 9.